The gates did not simply open, they wept, their iron hinges shrieking like old throats forced to confess. Beyond them, the path stretched narrow and strangled with weeds, leading the eye and the soul alike to the house that bent inward, as if listening to some secret misery. The Harrowgate house had always leaned, though no architect could explain why, and those who came too near swore they felt the pull of its walls, as if the structure hungered to fold them into its breast. The windows were not windows, but lids half shut upon restless eyes. Shuttered, yes, yet the suggestion of watching lingered in the spaces between, and when the night wind moved they did not creak like wood, but sighed like lips parting in dread. Some claimed the panes had caught the reflections of the family long dead and would not release them. Others whispered. The glass itself was grown from cooled tears. No one ever agreed, yet all agreed the house listened. The villagers would not say so aloud, not where ears might catch and repeat, but they knew the house remembered every footstep that dared to touch its threshold. Old records showed repairs attempted and abandoned. Timbers rotted not with time, but with something faster, sharper, as though gnawed by invisible mouths. Stone foundations, said to have been quarried from the earth itself, bore cracks resembling veins, blue-black and branching. Each year they deepened. Each year the ground beneath shivered, not with frost but with unease. On the path leading to the front door silence settled heavy. Not the silence of peace, but of strangled sound. Birds veered wide. Dogs stiffened and whimpered if tugged forward. Even the wind faltered, as though unwilling to brush its fingers against the shutters. The first time I saw the house, I swore I heard it breathe, a low inhalation beneath the earth, a pulse in the wood, the faintest throb like a slow heart muffled behind plaster. My guide, an old man whose eyes never rose above his shoes, muttered only, "Don't linger at the gate. Don't let it count you." His voice was frayed as though it had been scraped raw by repeating the warning too often. I asked, "Count me for what?" He only shook his head. The threshold loomed, its door swollen with age and weather, its paint blistered into a leprous skin. The knocker hung crooked, shaped like a hand that did not belong to man or angel. Its fingers were too long, bent back against themselves as though caught mid-spasm. Few dared touch it, yet all swore that sometimes when the moon hung low it rapped of its own accord. 3 slow strikes, as though summoning something already inside. The villagers tell of nights when the shutters opened without hands, and in the glass there were faces. Not 1 nor 4, but many, pale, familiar, overlapping as though the house could not decide which shape to wear. One woman, God save her, swore she saw herself among them. She left the village that very week, her bedclothes shredded, her hair turned white as frost. None speak her name now. The Harrowgate family, those who built and bled within those walls, were said to walk still. Not as ghosts, ghosts are mercy compared to what lingers, but as echoes bent and replayed. The stairs groan not with weight but with memory. The nursery shutters rattle even when nailed fast, as though small hands within wish to be let out. And through the chimneys, even when fire is cold, comes the sound of laughter, fractured, hollow, like bells rung under water. Inside the air thickens. Even in daylight, dust coils like smoke, though no fire burns. Every breath tastes of metal, as though the house itself exhaled blood. There are corridors that shorten when walked, staircases that lengthen, doors that do not open where they once led. The house is not dead wood and stone, but a shifting lung, a muscle, a memory. Every shuttered window watches, the guide whispered again. His lips trembled around the words, though his eyes never left the ground. Do not look back. If it knows your face, you'll carry its shadow. We stepped forward, and the boards groaned beneath my weight. Yet when the old man moved, the sound was absent, as though the house did not notice him anymore, or perhaps it had already swallowed him long ago. As I lifted my eyes, a single shutter shifted above us. Just a fraction, just enough to reveal the glimmer of something pale inside. It was not the pale of lace curtains. It was not the pale of candlelight. It was the pale of flesh, cheek pressed to glass, lips parted in a smile too wide to belong to a child. And then, before I could blink, the shutter closed. The house sighed deep and long, as though it had just finished saying my name. The night the Quadruplets were born, the wind itself seemed to shrink from the Harrowgate house, and with it, the mother's voice vanished, as though swallowed by some waiting darkness. She did not scream, did not gasp, did not whisper. Only her eyes, wide and wet, mirrored the terrible knowledge that something had shifted. Something unnatural had taken root within the walls and in her flesh. Those who glimpsed her in the candlelight said her lips moved without sound, forming prayers that fell into a void, never reaching the ears of God or man. The midwife who attended the birth whispered later, her hands trembling as she described the hush that filled the nursery. It was as though the air had thickened, she said, and even the flames on the hearth shivered and died. She did not speak. She did not breathe like the rest of us. And the children. Oh, the children. They cried in 4 voices at once, yet she did not answer. Not a word. It was said that from the moment of that first silence, the mother's presence became a cipher, a living riddle that both guarded and haunted her own offspring. Villagers spoke of seeing her at the windows, eyes wide and unmoving, staring into the mist of the night as if trying to swallow the horizon itself. She moved through the house like a shadow that obeyed its own shape, gliding past the furniture and corridors, never speaking, never calling. Children who strayed too close whispered she could hear them even without words. Some claimed she had swallowed her tongue deliberately, a sacrificial act to contain the devil that had slipped through the womb along with the quadruplets. The house, some whispered in corners of hushed rooms, had demanded silence in exchange for life, a pact forged in the first cry of the children. The mother's lips, pale and trembling, were locked forever against confession or curse, and yet the silence was not empty. It vibrated, a constant pulse like the hum of something imprisoned behind her ribs. Her hands, pale and long-fingered, seemed to articulate what her voice could not. A gesture toward a corner, and the shadows would twist as if obeying. A tremble of her wrist, and the children's cries would stutter into unnatural rhythm. She became the keeper of a secret language, a communion of gestures that no one else could decipher, least of all the doctors who came, armed with charts and scales, convinced that numbers could expose the horror. Her eyes, however, betrayed the truth. They flickered with memory and warning. Once a neighbor saw her standing by the doorway at midnight, and when their gaze met, it was as if the darkness behind her eyes spilled outward, brushing against the world. They ran, clutching their hair and skin, convinced she had reached for something beyond herself. Later they would swear they heard whispers in their own rooms, the words too faint to recognize, yet heavy enough to press upon their minds. The children, too, seemed aware of the mother's silence. They gathered near her not for comfort, but as though to anchor themselves to a fulcrum of restraint. Yet even their proximity could not pierce the shroud she carried. At night their cries would echo from the nursery, 4 voices harmonizing in dissonance, and she would sit motionless, hands folded, her face calm as the sea before a storm. The villagers said that in those moments the house itself trembled, listening, as though recording every echo for a reckoning yet to come. Once a priest ventured to pray in the room where she sat. He knelt and spoke, his words trembling in the thick air. "Blessed Mother, grant us your voice." She turned her head slowly, and in the candlelight her eyes reflected not the priest's face, but 4 shadowed infants, each stretching in a silent cry. He swore the room's temperature dropped, his breath fogging before him, and the mother's gaze did not waver. He left muttering prayers to no God, and the next morning he was found huddled beneath a tree on the outskirts of the village, lips stitched with mud, staring at nothing. The neighbors whispered that she had become more than human, less human perhaps. Her body seemed to absorb the chill of the rooms, and at times her shadow would detach from the rest of her, stretching along the floors and walls, pressing against corners where no light fell. Yet she moved through the house with purpose, never faltering, never acknowledging the invisible weight she carried. The silence she bore was not empty. It was a womb, holding something monstrous at bay. At times those brave or foolish enough to peek through the windows swore they saw her lips twitch in whispered conversation. 4 voices answered in the nursery. Only she spoke none. And yet, when the night deepened, it was clear the devil had not been vanquished, only delayed, lurking in the cracks of the floorboards, in the folds of her skirts, in the children who could not yet speak. On the 7th night after the birth, the moon hung low and swollen over Harrowgate, casting the house in a sickly silver glow. The mother sat by the nursery, hands clasped in her lap, and 4 cries rose in unison, jagged and ancient, echoing like bells struck by unseen fingers. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, glimmered with something feral, an awareness beyond the mortal veil. The shadows of the children stretched and writhed along the walls, twisting into forms too grotesque to name. And then, for a moment, the mother's lips parted slightly, and though no sound came, the wind carried it anyway, a vibration that hummed through the air, low and insistent, as if the house itself had inhaled the silence and was now ready to exhale it upon the world. Outside, the village dogs howled, and the night seemed to lean closer, listening. Inside, the mother's eyes glinted, unbroken, watching over the four, guarding them with the weight of a silence no one dared disturb. And in that stillness, a single shadow detached from the mother's form, slinking along the floor toward the nursery door, moving with a mind and hunger of its own. The night they first cried, the air in the nursery turned viscous, thick as if the house itself had exhaled a darkness too old to name. 4 voices rose in tandem, yet not in harmony but in a fractured chorus that seemed to split the room into quadrants of sound, each pitch tugging at the corners of reality. The midwife later whispered she had never encountered such cries. They were not simply human, but something other, a litany that pressed upon her chest and forced her to tremble on her knees. The cradles, 4 in number, were arranged in a perfect square beneath a single lamp, its flame quivering against the draught of the high shuttered windows. Shadows spilled and recoiled across the floor, stretching unnaturally, bending over the infants as though each child were tethered to a life separate from their own. Neighbors, peering through the glass from the fog-drenched lane, swore they saw these shadows writhe and twist independently, dark fingers curling and uncurling in rhythms the children could not possibly command. One elderly man who claimed to have been a soldier muttered, "They carry the weight of something older than the soil, something older than grief." The mother sat nearby, her silence a mantle heavy with power. Her eyes never left the children, yet she did not intervene. She did not cradle or soothe. Her hands rested folded in her lap, fingers interlaced like a lock keeping the unspoken from slipping free. And yet the house responded to her will. The walls groaned with subtle insistence, the floorboards beneath the cradles trembled, and the lamplight flickered in a rhythm that mirrored the infant's cries. It was as if the very house were a diaphragm, amplifying the resonance of these unnatural voices into some ritual only it could comprehend. The midwife recalled one child, the eldest in appearance, though none could claim to know their order, whose shadow lifted from the floor and clung to the wall, moving independently, coiling like a serpent in defiance of gravity. She had fallen back with a cry, the shadows recoiling in sharp arcs, and the child itself remained still, eyes wide and unblinking, staring as though it could perceive the boundary between the living and the spectral. "It watched me," she later murmured, her voice hoarse, as if it knew what I feared before I could name it. Visitors, few and braver souls, spoke of a dreadful symmetry in the room. 4 cries fractured by 4 shadows, each pairing moving in tandem yet never touching, never overlapping, always separate but always aware of the other. One physician, a man of counting and charts, leaned close to the first cradle and noted in his journal, "The shadow precedes the body's motion." Reflex, perhaps? No, something more. There is an intent in the darkness that mirrors and mocks life. The mother's eyes, pale and luminous, never left the children. She did not speak, yet her attention was palpable, pressing down on the room like a weight of iron and cold ash. The midwife claimed that at times the shadows would pause mid-motion, waiting for a gesture from her lips, though no sound emerged. The silence itself became a conductor for the chaos. The cradles rocked slightly, a breeze moved along the floorboards, and the shadows twisted in anticipation. Neighbors reported hearing it through the thin walls, voices, fourfold, chanting some wordless hymn in the dead of night. One woman, whose curiosity had driven her to peek from the window, fainted when she glimpsed what she later described as a 5th shadow, darker than all the rest, writhing between the children, watching, feeding. Upon awakening, she refused ever to speak of it again, and for weeks. Her lips trembled as if rehearsing words she would never utter. The children themselves were not ordinary. Their eyes seemed to hold a flicker of ancient knowledge, a glance that would fix upon a visitor and make the air taste cold and metallic. One night, the youngest, a girl it was said, stretched a tiny hand through the cradle bars, and the shadow nearest her reached for it. They did not touch, yet the air between them shivered. The lamp flickered, casting 4 grotesque reflections on the walls, each child mirrored by a dark twin. each twin slightly too long, slightly too thin, and all four moving in subtle, agonizing synchronicity. The house seemed to pulse with them, each heartbeat of wood and stone in rhythm with their cries. The floorboards beneath the cradles flexed as though breathing, and the walls leaned inward, as if straining to contain what they had helped summon. No one dared linger, yet none could leave. The nursery became a chamber of reverence and terror, where time itself seemed to fracture along the axes of the four infants' voices. At dawn, the mother rose silently and walked to the window. She traced the outline of one shadow with her gaze, and the shape flinched, recoiling back into the corner like an obedient servant. The midwife shivered. "They obey her," she whispered. "Even the darkness obeys her." And then, as morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, one shadow broke its bounds entirely. It lifted from the floor without sound, stretched its thin, spectral limbs toward the window, and seemed to taste the air beyond the glass. The other three shadows froze, still and rigid, watching. The mother's eyes narrowed, unblinking, and for the first time, a twitch of her lips suggested awareness beyond the ordinary. Outside, the fog shifted, curling unnaturally around the house, and the street remained empty. Inside, the shadows coiled tighter, each one straining toward something unseen, something that had just arrived at the edge of perception. The lamplight flickered violently, and for a heartbeat, the nursery was plunged into darkness. When it returned, one shadow was missing from its cradle. The child remained, eyes wide and innocent, but a void lingered where the darkness had once writhed, a space that seemed to suck in the edges of reality. And in that instant, a single, whispered chant rose from the empty corner, low, sibilant, four voices now carrying the hint of a fifth, an unspoken presence waiting, watching, and hungry. The first step across the threshold of Harrowgate House was like pressing a finger into the pulse of the earth itself, and the doctor felt it immediately, a tremor that ran through bone and marrow, whispering that reason was already a stranger here. He carried his instruments carefully, brass scales, calipers, and notebooks lined with grids, each page a promise of logic in a house that had long abandoned it. Yet the air inside was thick, damp with shadows that had mass and weight, pressing against the doctor's lungs as though the house itself inhaled in measured increments. He approached the nursery where the quadruplets lay, four cradles arranged like a geometry. No human hand could claim. Their cries had begun anew, jagged and sharp, each note splitting the room into quadrants of tremor. The shadows beneath the infants writhed in patterns that mocked the symmetry of his tools, stretching along the boards as if marking distances imperceptible to the naked eye. He began to measure, pen scratching against paper, but the ink bled before his eyes, curling into shapes that resembled bones and claws rather than numbers. This cannot be," he muttered, voice trembling against the thick silence. "These are measurements, simple measures, yet they bend." A whisper answered, not from the children, but from the shadows that clung to the walls. "Measure and fail. Measure and fall." The doctor froze, gaze darting to the corners where darkness pooled unnaturally. He told himself it was a trick of the lamplight, of his own imagination overworked by curiosity and fear. Yet when he bent closer to record the weight of the first child, the scales tipped without touch, a subtle, deliberate tilt, as if unseen hands were guiding the balance. The paper beneath his pen shifted, ink flowing into jagged symbols that mirrored the shadows in the room. His heart pounded, a wild rhythm that seemed almost audible above the four cries. He tried the calipers next, measuring limb against limb, but the bones of the infants did not correspond to human anatomy. Each arm and leg extended slightly, as if resisting capture, and every reading he recorded was contradicted by the next. The ink warped further, spiraling and knotting like serpents, crawling across the page in a language that teased understanding, and then withdrew. A cold draught swept the room, and the doctor shivered as if the walls themselves exhaled upon him. He looked up to see the mother standing in the doorway, pale and motionless, eyes unblinking. He had not heard her approach, had not noticed her presence until now. She did not speak, yet the air vibrated with the weight of her gaze. The shadows in the nursery stiffened, freezing mid-motion, and the children's cries faltered, split by a sudden tension. "You record what cannot be," the voice of the house, or perhaps hers, seemed to echo in the doctor's mind. "You cannot tame what watches itself." He stumbled backward, knocking a set of instruments to the floor. Brass rang against floorboards with a hollow clang, a sound swallowed immediately by silence. He bent to collect them, trembling, and glanced down at the notebook. The ink had rearranged itself into a series of vertical lines, jagged and precise, yet forming an impossible pattern, one that pulsed faintly as though it were alive. Each line seemed to beat with the rhythm of the children's cries, and in that rhythm he sensed a hidden logic, a geometry of horror beyond mortal comprehension. Logic must exist, he whispered to himself, though even his breath sounded uncertain. A sudden shift startled him. One of the shadows detached from the floor, coiling around a cradle with deliberate intent. The child beneath it remained still, yet the shadow twined around it like a serpent, protecting or suffocating. It was impossible to say which. The doctor raised his calipers, shaking, but the instrument bent in his hands as though the metal had become malleable, refusing obedience. He felt the house watching him now, every shadow a sentient sentinel. He turned to the mother instinctively, seeking instruction or reprieve, and saw the faintest twitch of her lips. Not a word, but the gesture was deliberate. The shadow withdrew slightly, and the children's cries resumed, but with a rhythm more fractured than before. The doctor realized with a cold certainty that nothing here obeyed him. His instruments, his observations, even the passage of time itself were subordinate to the house, to the mother, to some unseen architect of dread. He tried to record again, pen hovering above the warped ink, but every mark he made seemed to be swallowed, absorbed into the paper. The words he thought he had written vanished, leaving only curling tendrils of black that reached toward the edges of the page as if testing the boundaries of the physical world. A faint hiss echoed in his ears, like steam escaping a kettle. Yet there was no kettle, no heat, only the sound of inevitability. Then he saw it. In the reflection of the polished brass calipers, a fifth shadow, tall and slender, standing behind him. It had no features, yet the doctor knew it was aware of him, studying him with an intelligence that chilled the marrow. He spun around, but the shadow was gone. Only the nursery remained, 4 cradles, 4 children, 4 twisting, writhing shadows. Yet he felt it. That silent observer had moved through the room without sound, without trace, waiting. The mother's eyes caught his once more, and in them he glimpsed the truth. The children were not merely measured, the shadows not merely cast. There was a geometry of something older than science, a calculus that mocked human understanding, and the doctor, in his hubris, had walked into its domain. He sank to the floor, pen falling from numb fingers. The shadows continued to writhe, the children's cries rising again, jagged and fractured. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the faintest intonation of that fifth presence, a note that vibrated in the soul rather than the ear. And then, as he dared to lift his gaze, he saw it. A single page of his notebook had grown black with ink, forming a shape both familiar and impossible. It resembled the outline of the quadruplets, yet warped, twisted, a fifth figure curling between them like smoke-made flesh, staring out from the page with a void where its face should be. The doctor realized, with a terror that rooted him to the floor, that the house had begun to right itself, and he, the measurer of madness, had become its first mark. No one spoke it aloud, yet the fear of Harrowgate Lane hung over the village like a shadow too heavy to lift. Children were instructed to keep their eyes low, their footsteps hurried, voices stilled. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before it reached the crooked fences and ivy-choked gates. Mothers whispered warnings at doors, but no amount of caution could erase the memory of what had been glimpsed. Faces at windows that were not theirs, eyes that reflected not innocence but a pale and patient hunger. The lane itself was a narrow ribbon of stone, slick with moss and shadow, twisting unnaturally as it approached the house. The villagers spoke in half-words of the way the road seemed to shift underfoot, stones lengthening, hollows forming where none should be. Those who lingered too long beneath the upstairs windows reported dreams afterward, visions of their own faces, pale and still, staring from behind cracked panes. Sometimes the reflection would smile, though no mouth on earth could twist in such a cruel, knowing way old Jonas, the blacksmith, remembered the first time he had paused, a cart stuck in mud, his eyes lifting despite the warnings. He swore that 4 faces had pressed against the windows above, thin as paper, mouths opening in silent laughter that pressed cold into his chest. He dropped the reins, bolted, and for a week could not speak above a whisper. "They are not alive," he told anyone who would listen. And yet, they watch, they wait, and they remember. The children, smaller and braver in their ignorance, were particularly vulnerable. They would peer sideways at the house, daring to catch a glimpse, and some returned from the lane with eyes wide and wet, murmuring of strange movements, hands reaching behind curtains, shadows twisting independent of bodies, 4 small shapes that mirrored their every gesture. Parents silenced them quickly, punishing not for misbehavior but for daring to acknowledge the impossible. The lane became an unspoken line of fear, a corridor of obedience where one's gaze could mean ruin. Even at dawn, the windows held the memory of the night. The panes were not merely glass but lenses into a world stitched with dread. Villagers claimed they saw faces pressed against them when the house was empty. Faces of children who had never existed, whose cries were carried on a wind that did not touch the ground. One woman, clutching her shawl tightly, swore she saw her reflection in the upstairs window, her hair pale, eyes wide and hollow, lips parting in a silent scream. She ran screaming, convinced that the house had claimed the truth of her soul. The adults, those who thought themselves immune, were not spared. On market days, Harrowgate Lane ran through the heart of the village, and even in sunlight an odd heaviness lingered. One man, a baker, described his vision as he passed. A cluster of pale shapes behind the windows, moving with an intelligence beyond reason. He told his wife afterward that the figures mirrored him, mimicking his steps, raising invisible hands. And in the reflection, their mouths opened and closed in the silent chant that only his mind could hear. Whispers spread like smoke through the village. "Don't linger. Keep your eyes down. If they see you, they take a piece of you." No one said what the piece might be, only that it was felt in the marrow, an emptiness lodged deep in bone that never healed. Travelers passing through would remark upon the strangeness of the lane, its unnerving stillness, the way even birds avoided its length. Yet none could describe it fully without shivering, for the house itself seemed to draw words from memory, consuming them before they could escape the lips. At night, the silence became louder than any sound. The shutters shifted with a slow, deliberate creak, and shadows pooled beneath the eaves. Dogs refused to pass, their hair bristling, their low whines swallowed by the mist. Children hiding under blankets in neighboring homes swore they heard tapping above, a rhythm deliberate and unyielding, counting, always counting, as if something beyond the walls was marking time against them, old records, carefully kept by those too terrified to look too closely, told of disappearances that were never explained. A boy who lingered too long in the lane vanished at dusk. A woman who dared to peer too closely found herself standing at the edge of the forest, remembering nothing of the hours spent. The villagers began to speak of the mirroring, a curse that demanded attention, that punished observation with theft of self. Some whispered that the house did not merely watch, it learned and it remembered, and the reflection of you in its windows was the first step toward your undoing. One fog-heavy evening, young Miriam dared to trace a chalk line along the lane, marking her path in a bid to defy the fear. She stopped beneath the windows, breath shallow, heart hammering. In the dim light, 4 pale faces emerged behind the glass. They were exact, her own eyes, her small mouth, her hair curling like smoke. Yet their gaze was sharper, intent, probing as though they were assessing her worth. She froze, unable to breathe, as one of the mirrored figures lifted a hand and pressed it against the pane, and she felt it through her own skin, cold and searching. Her chalk fell, her fingers curling into the wet dirt. She ran, but the lane seemed longer than before, twisting unnaturally, stretching past itself. She dared not look back, but the pale faces followed her in memory, pressing into the back of her mind, refusing release. That night, she dreamed of herself trapped in a room of mirrors, each pane reflecting a part of her stolen by the house, screaming silently while the true self watched, paralyzed. And as she awoke, trembling and pale, the shadows beneath the Harrowgate windows shifted once more. 4 figures remained, but a 5th, faint and darker than the rest, lingered at the edge of their vision, peering out from the corner of the glass. It did not move like the others. Did not cry, did not breathe, it waited. Patient, deliberate, hungering for something unseen. The village exhaled silently into the night, the quiet fear heavy as stone, knowing that one glance could claim more than memory. The air in the nursery hung heavy with a stillness that tasted of iron and old wood, as though the house itself had paused to watch. The quadruplets lay in their cradles at first, silent, but when the moon struck the windows, their limbs began to twitch, not in play, not in whimsy, but in patterns too deliberate to belong to infants. One hand arched toward the ceiling, clawed fingers scraping the air. Another dug at the floorboards as if pulling out secrets. A third pointed toward the darkest corner of the room, where shadows pooled and shifted with a will of their own. No one had taught them these motions. No lullaby, no whispered spell could account for the geometry of their movement. The mother sat at the edge of the room, pale and unblinking, eyes fixed upon her children as though she read some hidden manuscript in the air. She did not touch them. She did not speak. And yet the house responded to her gaze. The walls leaned inward, the lamplight flickered, and the shadows under the cradles coiled like serpents taking measure. The patterns. "They are not play," whispered the midwife from the doorway, her voice trembling, barely carrying over the children's fourfold murmur of breath and sigh. They know what they are doing." The doctor, who had been summoned despite his better judgment, crouched low beside the cradles, instruments clutched like talismans. He measured wrists, counted fingers, traced arcs of movement with calipers, yet every reading warped beneath his hands. The children's gestures were precise and deliberate, yet impossible to chart. Every motion hinted at symmetry, yet contradicted itself, fracturing into forms no rational mind could comprehend. One child raised a hand toward the ceiling, and the shadow on the wall did not follow. It moved in a direction contrary to the body, stretching at impossible angles. Another clawed at the floor, and the wood beneath it seemed to flex and breathe with each stroke, grooves appearing as though etched by invisible fingernails. The fourth pointed toward the corner, and the shadows there twined, reaching, as though obeying some silent command. The mother's lips twitched faintly, and the shadows shuddered, bending closer to the children's bodies. The midwife took a step back. "It is a ritual," she whispered, voice caught between awe and terror. "A rite. I do not know what it calls, but it calls." The house itself seemed to pulse with their movements, a slow, deliberate thrum that pressed against the doctor's chest. The walls flexed as if counting the gestures. The floorboards groaned and the lamplight quivered, casting 4 elongated shadows that twisted around one another, sometimes merging, sometimes splitting, always obeying a pattern that belonged to neither man nor child. The doctor, desperate to impose logic, attempted to speak, to direct, to test the motions. "Move your hand toward me," he urged, voice brittle with strain. A single arm twitched, and yet the gesture split into 2 separate motions, one real and one shadow, and the shadow refused his command. It moved contrary to the child's will, pointing instead toward the darkest corner, where the 5th shadow had begun to coil silently, patient, waiting. The mother's eyes flicked to the doctor, and he felt an invisible pressure settle across his shoulders, folding his spine with the weight of unseen knowledge. "Do you see it?" she whispered without words, her lips moving in silence, and the shadows reacted, bowing slightly, twisting tighter, forming shapes that hinted at letters and sigils not meant for mortal comprehension. One night, the ritual reached a peak. The children's gestures split further, moving in 4 separate rhythms, each limb a conductor of a song no human could hear. The shadows beneath them multiplied, fracturing and weaving, merging into forms that resembled the family yet distorted beyond recognition. The doctor fell back, eyes wide, as he realized the 5th shadow had emerged fully, hovering near the corner of the room, its shape darker than night, thinner than air, yet heavy with intent. The mother rose, still silent, still unmoving but radiating authority. She extended a single hand toward the 5th shadow, and it recoiled slightly, recognizing her dominion. The children's limbs paused mid-motion, their gestures frozen in a tableau of uncanny symmetry. The doctor's pen, left abandoned on the floor, twitched as if alive, scribbling lines across the page that mirrored the motions before him, a diagram of madness too precise to belong to chance. "Do not interfere," the midwife hissed, trembling. "You will not survive its notice," the children resumed, but now their gestures split further. 4 into 8, 8 into 16, movements overlapping and fracturing, weaving a lattice of motion that seemed to pulse against the fabric of reality. Shadows mirrored them, but always one step behind, always slightly distorted. And always in the darkest corner, the fifth shadow lingered, watching, waiting, feeding on the spaces between gesture and form. The lamplight flickered violently, and for a heartbeat the room was cast into total darkness. When it returned, one of the infant's gestures had altered. A single finger now pointed toward the doctor, and he felt instantly the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations pressing upon him. The shadows recoiled slightly, the fifth observing more intently, as though noting the intrusion of a mortal into a sacred geometry. The mother's eyes glinted faintly in the lamplight. For the first time, a shiver ran through her form, subtle but deliberate. The shadows beneath the cradles twisted in response, coiling around the children in ways that hinted at protection and menace simultaneously. The air itself vibrated, carrying the faintest susurration. 4 voices, 5 now, merging in a sound felt in bone rather than ear, and then the fifth shadow detached completely, rising from its corner like smoke-given flesh. It hovered above the cradles, tendrils of darkness stretching toward the children, but stopping just short of touch. The mother's hand twitched again and the shadow paused, obedient yet restless. The doctor, frozen in terror, realized the impossible. The ritual was not complete, not fully formed. The shadows, the children, the house, the mother, they were all components of a design beyond reason. And the fifth shadow, patient, deliberate, hung poised at the edge of reality, waiting for the final gesture that would bind or unravel all. Outside, the wind howled down Harrowgate Lane, a chorus of warning and lament. Inside, the children moved as 1 and 4, their gestures splitting and fracturing into patterns that danced along the floor, along the walls, along the very edges of perception. And in the corner, the fifth shadow stretched its long, thin limbs toward the ceiling, reaching, reaching, reaching. The first words broke the night like splintering glass, sharp and cold, echoing against the walls as though the house itself had inhaled them and was reshaping them in its dark corridors. One sister, the youngest, lifted her lips, and a sound emerged that was not hers alone. It carried the weight of 4 voices layered upon one another, like a choir singing through hollow bone, a resonance that pressed into the skull and lingered long after the echo faded. Every villager who heard it later shivered in recollection, as if their own thoughts had been folded into the sound. "I do not speak," she whispered, or rather, the voices did, passing through her as a vessel. "I am only repeating what the fifth demands." The mother sat nearby, silent, unmoving, yet her presence pressed like lead against the doctor's chest. He had watched the pattern of their gestures, traced the choreography of the children's limbs, and understood at last that sound was merely another form of the ritual. Motion and voice, shadow and flesh, they were components of an order older than comprehension. And now the fifth had chosen a mouth. The nursery was still save for the slow rhythm of the child's speech, echoing with layers that no mortal tongue could imitate. Each word was precise yet warped, as if the sound itself trembled at its own existence. The shadows beneath the cradles writhed, stretching and curling toward the child's voice, listening, obeying, shaping themselves around the syllables in patterns invisible to the human eye. "You must listen," the midwife whispered from the doorway, her hands clutched over her mouth. "Do not forget a single word or it will remember you." The doctor leaned forward, pen poised over a notebook, but his ink refused him. It pooled and twisted like black smoke on the page, forming glyphs that hinted at meaning, yet receded when he tried to hold them. He realized with cold certainty that nothing he recorded would remain unaltered. The house itself, the fifth, and now the speaking sister, were rewriting reality with every syllable. The child continued, the fourfold resonance swelling, undulating, and folding back upon itself. For it spoke not only in words but in suggestion, shaping the air, coaxing the shadows into forms that resembled other children, other sisters who had never existed. Their shapes moved in silent obedience, mirroring the words as they wove themselves into invisible latticework across the room. "I am only the echo," she said again, voice layered, vibrating. "Do not look for me. Look for the fifth." The doctor shivered. He dared not glance toward the darkest corner, yet he felt it. The fifth shadow, impossibly thin, impossibly long, coiled and patient, stretching toward the child's voice like a hand probing the depths of the room. It had always been present, lurking at the edge of perception, a being whose will had shaped the children's movements from the first day. Now it had claimed a vessel, and the room responded with an intensity that pressed against the walls and ceiling, bending the air itself. The mother's hands twitched slightly, barely perceptible, yet the shadows responded instantly. They rose, lifting off the floorboards, stretching like ink spilled across the walls. The children's limbs, once separate, moved in synchrony with the voice, each gesture accentuating the syllables as though conducting a melody written in darkness. The house groaned, a long, deep resonance that vibrated through the floor, through the doctor's spine, through every bone in the room. The midwife stumbled back, whispering a prayer to nothing as the youngest voice rose in intensity. The sound seemed to unmake the air, drawing it toward the fifth, who extended a tendril of shadow that slithered across the nursery floor, pausing just before touching the child. It hovered there, waiting, a coiled intelligence that responded to neither mortal command nor instinctual fear. Then, for a moment, the child faltered. The voices broke, splintering into 4 distinct tones, each discordant, each tugging at the boundaries of comprehension. The fifth shivered with awareness, and the mother's eyes flicked downward, observing, judging. The shadows froze mid-motion, then slowly began to wrap around each other, forming knots of darkness that pulsed in time with the faltering words. The doctor felt his mind stretch to its breaking point, understanding that language itself had become a weapon, a conduit of power beyond human measure. The voices carried intent, and intent carried consequence. Each syllable shaped the room, the shadows, even the house itself. He realized in a flash of terror that the child was not speaking for herself, not for her own survival, not for comprehension, but as a mouthpiece for something vast and patient, something older than reason. The layered voices stammered, fracturing yet binding together, and the fifth reached thin and deliberate toward the ceiling. The lamplight flickered violently, shadows stretching into forms that resembled the doctor himself, elongated and twisted, staring with hollow, unblinking eyes. The midwife gasped. "It remembers us," she whispered. "Every heartbeat, every thought, every fear. It remembers." The child's voice swelled once more, 4-fold, 5-fold, and the shadows beneath the cradles writhed, stretching outward as though attempting to claim the edges of the room. The mother's hand twitched again, a subtle motion that reshaped the patterns of darkness, bending them into a lattice that pressed closer to the speaking sister, guarding her and the fifth simultaneously. And then, in a silence that fell like a tombstone, the fifth detached fully from its corner, curling around the child in a coil of darkness that obscured the floor entirely. The layered voices trembled, warping, bending the air like fabric, and the lamplight flickered to reveal a fifth form in the nursery, neither shadow nor child, but a coalescence of both, a being of intent and hunger that had at last claimed form. The doctor's pen fell, clattering uselessly onto the floor. The midwife backed away, clutching her robe, unable to tear her gaze from the impossible figure. And the child, mouth moving, lips shaping words that belonged to no mortal tongue, whispered a single sentence that echoed through the house and into the very marrow of those who dared to hear. "We are ready." The fifth commands. "Will you answer?" The shadows quivered. The room seemed to pulse in anticipation, and outside the wind along Harrowgate Lane carried a sound like 4 voices crying in unison, calling to those who lingered too close. The mother's eyes flicked toward the window, and for a heartbeat, the doctor saw not her reflection, but 5 pale faces staring back, eyes unblinking, mouths open in a silent chant that promised nothing but reckoning. The flames hissed like 1,000 serpents, spitting sparks into the fog-heavy night. Yet the fire refused to claim the Harrowgate house. Timber roared and flamed, licking the edges of the walls, yet each tongue of heat recoiled as if burned by some unseen hand. Smoke writhed upward, coiling into shapes that resembled pale faces pressed against windows, faces that grinned with cruel satisfaction, watching the villagers stumble backward in terror. They had come with torches and pitch, their courage bolstered by fear and hope in equal measure. Fathers swung buckets of oil, mothers hurled kindling, children shrieked from the edges of the lane, but every attempt to consume the house ended in frustration. The fire bent strangely, arcs of heat curling backward, sparking against themselves, retreating before they could touch the walls. The villagers felt the air thicken, sticky with memory, with intent, as if the house itself exhaled in quiet amusement. Old Jonas, Hands trembling on the hilt of a pitchfork, swore he saw the boards glow from within, veins of red light crawling beneath the surface, tracing patterns he had never carved. "It remembers," he whispered, voice caught in ash-choked throat. "Every flame we send, it turns against us. Every attempt, it keeps." The mother, standing at the top window, did not move, did not lift a hand, yet the children inside stirred, shadows dancing along their cradles, coiling like ink. Fourfold and fivefold, their silhouettes traced the flames outside, their gestures precise, rehearsed as if directing the fire itself. The youngest, the mouthpiece of the fifth, gazed outward, lips moving in silent syllables that bent the heat and smoke to their will. From the lane, a scream erupted as a torch flared unexpectedly, bending in mid-air, trailing embers backward toward the thrower. The villagers scrambled, tripping over stones, clutching their throats as if the house had reached into their chests. Every crackle of fire sounded deliberate, purposeful, a chorus of warning. Yet the Harrowgate house remained untouched, its timbers intact. Though the red glow beneath its walls suggested a memory, a searing history that burned hotter than any flame. The doctor, standing at the far edge of the village, pressed a trembling hand against his face. It is alive," he whispered. "Not merely timber and stone. It thinks, it remembers. Every ember, every attempt, it folds back upon itself." He glanced at the mother's figure in the window, pale as moonlight, and realized that the fifth shadow had extended fully, coiling through the nursery, reaching toward the house's outer walls, as if guiding the invisible currents of flame. From within the nursery, a voice layered and fourfold carried on the wind, low and sonorous. "You may try, you may burn, but what is fire to memory? What is flame to the unseen?" The villagers recoiled, some dropping torches, some clutching their children. One woman, brave or foolish, tried to approach the front door, carrying a brazier heavy with coal, but the smoke twisted around her, forming elongated fingers that pried at her arms and legs, tugging gently yet insistently, until she fell backward. A cry caught and folded into the shifting air. She scrambled to rise, eyes wide, only to find the shadows along the ground had lengthened, creeping toward her in sinuous arcs. The flames themselves bent back upon the ground, licking her heels without consuming, a mirror of her own terror. It was as though the house consumed not matter, but the intent behind the flame, the desperation, the fear, the hope of the villagers, and folded it into memory, storing it within the timbers like a cache of souls. The children's shadows stretched now to the windows, 4 or 5 forms flickering in unison, shaping the reflections of the flames into impossible geometries. One shadow seemed to split, then rejoin, coiling through itself, tracing a pattern of fire and smoke that the doctor recognized, not as numbers or letters, but as a sigil of control, a ritual etched into the air itself. Old Jonas fell to his knees, hands pressed over ears, mumbling, "It keeps, it remembers." Every attempt, every prayer, every scream. A sudden flare of heat pushed him forward, a wind carrying the scent of ash and iron. The house seemed to lean into the fire, glowing red beneath its pale timbers, veins of remembered flame pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the walls. The mother moved, finally, stepping away from the window, lifting her hand slightly. Instantly, the shadows under the cradles twined upward, flowing through the nursery like liquid darkness. The youngest girl, the one who spoke for the fifth, raised a hand, lips shaping words that twisted the smoke above the roof. The flames outside bent again, curving inward, forming a protective arc around the house, leaving the structure untouched, but radiating a red heat that seemed to pierce the eyes of anyone who looked too long. The villagers retreated, stumbling into the lane, faces pale, voices hoarse, torches extinguished by unseen gusts. They turned to look once more. The Harrowgate house stood, unbroken, silent, glowing faintly red from within as though the memory of attempted destruction burned hotter than any flame ever could. And behind the windows, 4 or 5, pale faces pressed against the glass, unmoving, watching, waiting, as though memorizing every flicker, every fear, every heartbeat of the night. Then, in the quiet that followed, a single tendril of smoke rose from the chimney, dark and thin, coiling into a shape that resembled the fifth shadow. It stretched toward the lane, reaching into the minds of the villagers, whispering words they could not remember in the morning. words that carried weight in bone and marrow. And in the nursery, the youngest girl looked outward, her voice a faint hum. Unheard yet felt, it remembers all. And soon it will act. The red glow beneath the walls pulsed again, deep and deliberate, like the heartbeat of a thing older than fire, older than fear, waiting for the moment when memory would become reality. The day the scholars arrived, the sky itself seemed to recoil, a dull grey pressing down like lead upon Harrowgate Lane. Doctors, priests and charlatans alike converged, instruments and tomes clutched in trembling hands, each certain that knowledge could cage what was not meant to be understood. They spoke in clipped phrases, hurried Latin and scribbled symbols, their voices sharp against the whispering wind. Yet even as they moved, the shadows around them betrayed their presence. Each reflection in the windows, each shimmer along the cobblestones, lagged a heartbeat behind, turning and recoiling a second too late, as if the house itself manipulated the very flow of perception. The villagers stayed at a careful distance, watching from behind fences and trees, pale faces pressed to gaps in wood. They whispered warnings, "Do not linger, do not watch too long." The reflections do not forgive. Yet the scholars, intoxicated by hubris, ignored them. They measured angles, counted floorboards, inspected cradles, and charted every flicker of candlelight, unaware that their own mirrored selves were already taking notes, recording errors, reshaping intention. Inside the nursery, the quadruplets moved, silent and precise, their gestures now more deliberate than ever. Limbs split and recombined in impossible choreography, casting shadows that wriggled and multiplied along the walls. The youngest girl, mouthpiece of the fifth, observed the newcomers with an uncanny awareness, lips parting just slightly, shaping syllables that bent the reflections around the intruders. "They think they can measure it," whispered the midwife, clutching her shawl tightly, voice quivering. "But the house, the children, they are never alone." The lead doctor, a gaunt man with spectacles that magnified his wild eyes, crouched beside a cradle. His pen scratched feverishly across parchment, yet the ink seemed to curl and twist beneath his hands, forming equations and diagrams that dissolved into black tendrils, crawling across the page and toward his fingers. He blinked aghast and noticed his reflection in the nursery window. It lagged by a second, a pale copy that mimicked his motion almost perfectly, except its eyes glinted with intelligence he did not recognize. The shadows under the cradles shifted in response to the scholar's intrusion. Four stretched toward the windows, then coiled, then split again, twisting into fractal shapes that mimicked the equations, charts, and sacred sigils the doctors and priests scrawled. One shadow lifted a thin tendril, brushing the edge of a ledger, causing the ink to smear, warping their meticulous records. Another stretched toward a candle, bending the flame back upon itself, so the light no longer illuminated but obscured, folding the room into a lattice of impossible geometry. A priest muttered prayers, hasty and loud, attempting to claim authority. "By the cross, by the word, be bound!" But the words faltered, catching in the air like stones absorbed and rewritten by the room itself. The youngest girl's voice rose faintly, fourfold, fivefold, shaping the syllables into a melody that twisted around the priest's reflection. It recoiled, delayed, mimicking motion imperfectly, and he stumbled, heart pounding, as if the room had reached inside him to remind him of his own fragility. One of the charlatans, a thin man with a crooked smile, laughed nervously, lifting a compass over the floorboards. The shadows responded immediately, snaking across the wood, and when the compass touched the grain, the floor seemed to pulse beneath him, lines twisting as though alive. He leapt backward, tripping over a crate, and the shadows followed, not cruelly, but with patient observation, noting his panic, cataloguing his fear. The mother watched silently, perched on the edge of the stairs. She did not move, yet her presence orchestrated the room like a conductor. Every gesture of the children, every lagging reflection, every curling shadow responded to her unspoken command. Even the fifth shadow, now fully uncoiled, hovered in the corner like a sentinel, observing the scholars with a patient hunger, waiting for the moment when observation itself would become consequence. The lead doctor attempted to lecture, voice cracking. This is natural, it can be measured, explained. Shadows lag because of light, reflection, human perception. But his reflection in the window smiled faintly before he did. It twitched, stretched, and leaned closer than physics allowed, the eyes glinting with comprehension beyond his own. The air around him felt heavy, thickened with the memory of every failed experiment the house had absorbed over decades. Outside, the villagers murmured uneasily. They had seen enough to understand that science here was not a tool, but a temptation. The windows of Harrowgate did not merely reflect, they remembered, recorded, and perhaps corrected. Any attempt to master what lay within would be catalogued, mirrored, and returned in forms not meant for the human mind, one by one. The scholars felt it. Their thoughts lagged, intentions slowed, reflexes delayed. Objects fell a second after their hands reached, words caught in throats, pens scribbled after the mind had thought them. The house, the children, and the fifth were not only observing, they were measuring, storing, and rewriting the very flow of reality. A sudden scream cut through the room. The youngest girl had spoken again, words shaped by the fifth. "You cannot know us. You cannot know yourselves." Shadows twisted sharply, forming figures that resembled the scholars themselves, though longer, thinner, impossibly precise, watching, mimicking, and correcting their movements. The lead doctor dropped to his knees, eyes wide, realizing that for every action, there was a lagging consequence, and the house kept perfect score. The mother's eyes glinted faintly as she lifted a hand toward the ceiling. Shadows coiled tighter around the children, lifting off the floor, stretching toward the scholars, bending reality in subtle, insidious ways. The fifth stretched upward, extending an impossibly long tendril toward the window, and for a moment the world seemed to slow, each heartbeat echoing like a bell tolling in empty air. And then, in a silence that pressed into every corner, one reflection moved ahead of its owner, a subtle twitch that no human could anticipate. The doctor looked up, and for a fleeting moment, the mirrored version of himself grinned. Not him, yet entirely him, and in its eyes burned the knowledge that no calculation, no prayer, no feigned understanding could contain what waited inside Harrowgate House. Outside, the wind carried whispers of the children's movements, fourfold and fivefold, touching the edges of the lane, rustling leaves in time with the lagging reflections. As if every shadow of the village had begun to mirror itself, the lead doctor's pen fell, the priest's voice caught, and the charlatan's compass spun wildly. And in the nursery, the youngest girl's voice, layered and hollow, whispered through the walls, soft but certain. "The fifth measures. The fifth remembers, and now it knows you." The shadows stretched once more, coiling toward the ceiling, converging around the children, and the house itself seemed to lean in closer, as if pressing its face against the night. The house breathed in the twilight, ancient timbers swelling with secrets, the faint groan of hinges speaking of years that had witnessed more than human eyes could bear. Harrowgate stood silent yet alive, its doors swollen with age, warped by memory and the weight of untold horrors. Every shuttered window reflected the dusk strangely, a red-orange that shimmered like the pulse of something beneath the floorboards, something patient, waiting. Villagers still whispered of the bloodline, though most avoided the lane entirely. "Fourfold and fivefold," they said, lips trembling, eyes darting toward the dark silhouette of the roof. "Each child carries a part, a fragment of something no mirror should reveal." Mothers clutched their children close, sensing the unseen inheritance pressing against the boundaries of their lives, and fathers muttered prayers that seemed to shatter against the walls of the house. Inside, the quadruplets sat in their cradles, now no longer infants but children, who carried the weight of their peculiar legacy. Shadows clung to them like skin, twisting and coiling with a life of their own, as if the fifth had become not a visitor, but a permanent presence. Their limbs moved in subtle symmetries, hands rising and falling, shadows stretching across the floor and walls, tracing patterns that hinted at language older than scripture. The youngest girl, the mouthpiece of the fifth, rose slowly. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied, carrying a resonance that fractured through 4 and sometimes 5 layers. "It watches," she whispered, tone both innocent and knowing. "It waits, and we are the inheritance." The mother remained silent, perched at the staircase like a figure carved from moonlight. Her eyes did not waver. They traced every shadow, every flutter of breath, every tremor in the children's movements. Though her lips did not move, the house responded, bending subtly toward her will. The timbers hummed faintly, responding to her presence as if she were both master and vessel. The doctor, now aged and broken from years of fruitless attempts to chart the impossible, leaned against the doorway, trembling. I've seen their shadows, their movements, their voice, he muttered, voice hollow. But I cannot measure, cannot predict, cannot survive the sight of what they are becoming. His eyes darted to the mirror in the hall, and there it was, 4 or 5 reflections staring back at him, each a fragment of something monstrous, yet incomprehensibly human. Each mirrored form twisted subtly, refusing his gaze, hiding secrets that should not be glimpsed. The house seemed to inhale, drawing in the evening air, stretching the shadows along the walls like living ink. The floorboards shifted beneath invisible weight, creaking in patterns that suggested deliberate motion, as if the very foundation of Harrowgate had memory and intent. The children's gestures now carried subtle command, fingers pointing to corners, elbows tracing unseen angles, heads tilting in perfect rhythm with the pulses beneath the walls. A flicker of movement in the 5th shadow caught the doctor's attention. It had grown indistinct, now a coalescence of all 4 children, stretching into forms both familiar and impossible. It hovered near the staircase, tendrils reaching subtly toward the mother, and he realized with a shiver that the 5th had become inseparable from the family, a presence woven into the bloodline itself. Outside, the wind carried whispers through the broken lane, voices layered fourfold, echoing faintly against the house's walls. The villagers, long abandoned by courage, felt their own reflections shimmer strangely in the dark, subtle distortions hinting that the inheritance was not confined to Harrowgate, that the bloodline's shadow had begun to reach beyond the lane, beyond the night into their own homes. The youngest girl spoke again, voice low and deliberate. We are what the house remembered. We are what the house demands. We are the inheritance. Shadows coiled around her like dark serpents, rising, stretching, twisting into impossible angles that defied geometry. The 4 or 5 forms merged and separated, a living sigil writ large across floor and wall. The mother's hands lifted faintly, and for a moment, the room was filled with the soft susurration of memory, echoing across decades, lullabies warped into chants, footsteps that did not exist, whispers of the villagers long dead, and the faintest hint of flame that had never consumed. The house itself seemed to pulse, a heart beating beneath layers of timber and shadow, drawing the doctor's attention to the warped mirrors, the reflections, and the unblinking eyes of the children. He realized the terrible truth. The inheritance was not only in blood, but in perception, in shadow, in reflection. Any who dared to watch, to measure, to understand, were already drawn into it, becoming part of the lattice of the house's memory. He tried to look away, but his own reflection held him, 4-fold, 5-fold, and whispering truths his mind could not bear. The children's shadows stretched toward him, fracturing and splitting, pointing toward places unseen, fingers curling and uncurling with purpose. The youngest girl's voice carried one final warning. Do not touch the inheritance. It will touch you. And then the 5th, coalesced fully around the staircase, rose like a living silhouette, stretching its thin, impossible limbs toward the ceiling, blotting out the lamp's glow. The house trembled faintly, the floorboards groaned, and the shadows along the walls elongated to impossible lengths, casting 4 or 5 faces in the corners, each one pale, unblinking, and aware. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a soft susurration, a distant echo of 4 voices, or perhaps 5, repeating across Harrowgate Lane, calling to anyone who might see, anyone who might linger. We are the inheritance. And now it begins. The doctor fell to his knees, eyes wide, as the shadows pressed closer, merging into impossible shapes, the walls themselves bending toward the children, toward the 5th. The house pulsed, glowing faintly beneath its swollen doors, veins of red light tracing patterns that hinted at memory, power, and consequence. And for the first time, the doctor understood that the Harrowgate bloodline had not merely survived, it had multiplied, divided, and hidden within itself fragments of something no mirror should ever reveal. And in the final moment of twilight, the youngest girl tilted her head toward the doorway, eyes glinting, lips parting to speak.